On March 17, 1862, Union Major General George B. McClellan finally begins his planned spring offensive against Richmond, after much hounding by both the President and the press to do something with his massive force gathered around Washington. That day, McClellan's Army of the Potomac, numbering 121,500 men and counting 44 artillery batteries, 1,150 supply wagons, and over 15,000 horses, begins departing from Union-occupied Alexandria, Virginia, to sail down the Potomac River into the Chesapeake Bay before finally debarking at the Federal stronghold at Fort Monroe on the tip of the Virginia Peninsula. At long last, McClellan's offensive, dubbed the Peninsula Campaign, has begun. The armada transporting the Federal Army dwarfs all previous American expeditions. One British observer with the Army of the Potomac remarks that the Union advance is the stride of a giant. In response to the Federal movement towards the Virginia Peninsula, Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston, commanding the newly formed Department of Northern Virginia, a field army organized on March 14th after merging units from the former Confederate Army of the Potomac and the Army of the Northwest, begins ordering a withdrawal of his new army's forces from their defensive lines, entrenchments, and former winter quarters around Manassas Junction to reinforce the defenses around Richmond. The deadlock in the Eastern Theater that has lasted through the fall and winter of 1861-62 is finally over. Now both Johnston's and McClellan's armies are on the move. Throughout late March and the first few days of April, McClellan's Army of the Potomac begins consolidating itself at Fort Monroe. The Army of the Potomac's 121,500 men are divided into 3 corps, as well as other attached units. Commanding 2nd Corps is Brigadier General Edwin V. Bull Sumner, with 2 divisions under Brigadier Generals Israel B. Richardson and John Sedgwick. The 3rd Corps is led by Brigadier General Samuel P. Heintzelman, with 3 divisions led by Brigadier Generals Fitz John Porter, Joseph Hooker, and Charles S. Hamilton, respectively. 4th Corps is under the command of Brigadier General Erasmus D. Keyes, with the divisions of Brigadier Generals Darius N. Couch, William F. Baldy Smith, and Silas Casey subordinate. Other divisions of the Army of the Potomac are either being held in reserve or posted closer to Washington in order to guard against any possible attacks or raids by Confederate forces from Major General Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson's Valley District, headquartered at Winchester in the upper Shenandoah Valley. However, after much politicking with the President, McClellan is able to secure Brigadier General William B. Franklin's 1st Division of Major General Irvin McDowell's 1st Corps for the upcoming campaign. Immediately facing McClellan's gigantic army mustering at Fort Monroe is a relatively small Confederate command under Major General John B. Magruder. The Army of the Peninsula, initially numbering only 11,000 to 13,000 men before the arrival of reinforcements from Johnston's army, Magruder's outnumbered army is stretched out along a series of defensive lines and earthwork fortifications dubbed the Warwick Line, as they are spread along the Warwick River and Mulberry Point on the James River from the south, all the way north across the peninsula towards the York River in Yorktown. Yorktown is the site of the famous Siege of Yorktown and the subsequent surrender of General Lord Cornwallis's British Army forces in 1781, near the end of the American Revolutionary War. The previous year, Magruder had overseen the construction of numerous defenses and fortifications on the Virginia Peninsula in the event of a Union advance towards Richmond from that direction. He had his men build a series of 3 fortified lines, beginning with 3 earthwork fortifications spanning the peninsula between Deep Creek and the Poquoson River. This was designated as the 1st Peninsula Defense Line. Behind that, he built the Warwick Line, centered around Yorktown, which was branded as the 2nd Peninsula Defense Line. Finally, Magruder built a network of 14 redoubts with interconnected earthworks and rifle pits located in front of and to the west of Williamsburg. The line runs from College Creek on the James River to Queens Creek on the York. forming the 3rd Peninsula Defense Line is its main fortification in front of Williamsburg, is a large earthwork bastion the general named Fort Magruder. It is these 3 defense lines that the Army of the Potomac will have to break through in order to carve a clear path towards Richmond. In all, it would be about 80 miles from Fort Monroe to the Confederate capital. On April 4th, Major General McClellan issues orders to his Army of the Potomac to begin advancing up the Virginia Peninsula towards Richmond. Having completed the debarkation and consolidation at Fort Monroe of more than 58,000 men and counting. That day, Union forces advanced against Magruder's 1st Peninsula Defense Line. Elements of General Keyes' 4th Corps briefly skirmished with Confederate troops defending Magruder's far right flank at Young's Mill, a strong point on Deep Creek. This heavily outnumbered Confederate force quickly withdraws in the face of such heavy opposing numbers. However, the following day, the Army of the Potomac's drive towards Yorktown is brought to a surprising halt when the Federals begin encountering the more formidable defensive works and trenches of the Warhawk Line. Since Johnston's Department of Northern Virginia has yet to arrive at Yorktown at this point, Magruder's small command is vastly outnumbered, and so General Magruder conjures up a plan of deceit, moving his forces in parade formation across the Warhawk Line and making it appear as though his forces are larger than they actually are. To enhance the bluff, the general adds Quaker guns, wooden poles painted to appear as cannons, all across the trenches. McClellan decides to take the side of caution as he believes the Confederates number over 50,000 men compared to his own current force of roughly 60,000. Orders the Federals to begin a siege operation against the Warhawk Line in Yorktown. Thus, the Siege of Yorktown begins on April 5, 1862, a day into McClellan's Peninsula Campaign, and the Army of the Potomac is already stalled in its advance towards Richmond. Sunday, April 6th, dawn clears and pleasant, and at first light, the observation hot air balloon Intrepid, piloted by Professor Thaddeus C.S. Lowe, the New Hampshire Yankee who heads McClellan's Aeronaut Corps, arises majestically from behind the trees to spy out the Yorktown defenses. On the ground, dozens of other Federals creep forward with telescopes and field glasses on the same mission. General Magruder, continuing his game of bluff, provides them with a good deal to see, but little that is distinct. His artillerists and sharpshooters continue to fire at the slightest movement, and the Yankee observers have to keep their distance. Some of McClellan's generals are eager that morning to see what is really behind the fierce front Magruder displays. Charles S. Hamilton, leading the 3rd Division in Heintzelman's 3rd Corps, says he cannot see much in the way of any actual defenses in the gap between Yorktown's ramparts and the headwaters of the Warhawk River. Heintzelman and Hamilton go to Army headquarters to seek permission for reconnaissance and force to probe the spot. They get nowhere with the idea. McClellan's favorite lieutenant, Brigadier General Fitzjohn Porter, and his chief engineer, Brigadier General John Barnard, both strongly second the commanding general's decision to do nothing more than dig in where they are. As Barnard wrote in appraising the siege, the project of an assault was mere harebrained folly. Just then, however, an actual reconnaissance in force is being launched against another part of Magruder's line, and it very nearly succeeds. Leading the left wing of the Federal advance is the 4th Corps' 2nd Division of Brigadier General William F. Smith, who since his West Point days had been known as Baldy for his thinning hair. Baldy Smith is an aggressive, contentious sort, with little faith in the resolve of his corps commander, Brigadier General Erasmus D. Keyes. And that morning he acts on his own in ordering 2 regiments to investigate the Warhawk River line to see if there are any holes in it. Smith assures the leader of the expedition, Brigadier General Winfield Scott Hancock, that if a hole is found he would send him strong reinforcements to exploit it. After seeing off his reconnaissance, Smith rides to Keyes' headquarters to let his superior know in a conversational way what he had done. As they talk, a messenger arrives from McClellan's headquarters. Keyes reads the dispatch and without a word hands it to Smith. No action is to be initiated against the enemy, it reads, until the engineers have thoroughly studied the rebel line and determined the best approach. Smith, very much chagrined, rushes back to the front to recall Hancock. General Hancock says he had already discovered the weak spot that they were looking for, and that it could be taken easily. No matter now, Smith tells him, it was out of their hands. Baldy Smith always believed that had McClellan's order arrived an hour or two later, he would have broken the enemy's line and ended the siege of Yorktown the day it began. Ironically, this aborted assault furnishes Major General McClellan with the evidence he needs to prove he had done the right thing in putting Yorktown under siege. Hancock comes back with 4 prisoners from the 14th Alabama who were so talkative that it was likely they were members of John Magruder's acting company. Under questioning by one of Alan J. Pinkerton's detectives, the Alabamians reveal that the rebel line on the Warwick is manned by 40,000 men, which could grow in a few days to 100,000. Joe Johnston himself was expected that day along with 8,000 reinforcements. McClellan takes the baited hook. On April 7th, he telegraphs Washington, all the prisoners state that General J.E. Johnston arrived in Yorktown yesterday with strong reinforcements. It seems clear that I shall have the whole force of the enemy on my hands, probably not less than 100,000 men and possibly more. As a result of the government's deductions from his command, my force is possibly less than that of the enemy. To take the offensive now would be fatal. Were I in possession of their entrenchments and assailed by double my numbers, I should have no fears as to the result. Simply to continue the siege, he must have more men and more heavy guns. President Lincoln urges him to break the enemy's line in front of them immediately. The country could not fail to note that the present hesitation to move upon an entrenched enemy is but the story of Manassas repeated. I beg to assure you that I have never written you or spoken to you in greater kindness of feeling than now, but you must act. McClellan ignores the overture. He writes his wife that the president has urged him to make an attack and added, I was much tempted to reply that he had better come and do it himself. John Magruder continues to direct his charade bravely enough, but he is not confident that it will hold together much longer. On the evening of April 6, he telegraphs General Robert E. Lee in Richmond that the enemy observers in the air and on the ground have been active along every part of his line throughout the day. They discovered a weak point, he reports, and while he would make every effort to shore up the spot he worries that numbers must prevail, reinforcements are reaching him very slowly and will probably be too late. The previous evening, a brigade had arrived from Major General Benjamin Huger's division in Norfolk, officially designated in reports as the Department of Norfolk, but that day had brought Magruder just 2 regiments from across the James and no troops from Johnston's army. Prince John is not one to display his concerns outwardly. However, in full regalia with staff and escort, he rides his lines from one end to the other, radiating confidence, encouraging his troops, looking every inch the part of commanding general, or more accurately in the circumstances, every inch the part of leading actor. Richmond is almost 60 miles from the scene of conflict at Yorktown, but already there is a palpable sense of crisis in the Confederate capital. Martial law is imposed on the city, the sale of liquor prohibited, and all military furloughs canceled. Additional state militia are called to the colors to supplement the half-dozen militia units already serving with Magruder on the peninsula. The women of Richmond, responding to the appeal from the authorities, stitched together 30,000 sandbags for Yorktown's defenders in 30 hours. The Confederate Congress sitting in the Virginia State Capitol building debate a revolutionary bill to conscript men into the army, and Richmond City Council appropriates funds to bolster the city's defenses. According to the Southern newspaper, the issues building at Yorktown is tremendous, for the stake is enormous, being nothing less than the fate of Virginia. The editor goes so far as to compare the army McClellan is assembling to march on Richmond to the Grand Army Napoleon had assembled to march on Moscow 50 years before. The capital's mood brightens considerably when General Joe Johnston's army begins to arrive from the Rapidan River. A steady parade of Johnston's troops start through the city on April 6, the very day Magruder remarks on how slowly help is reaching him. While there is no official announcement of the fact, it is obvious to all that the army is on the march to meet McClellan on the peninsula, and spirits soar. A Mississippi soldier writes home, "Richmond is one living, moving mass of soldiers, and today the streets show nothing but a continuous stream on their way to Yorktown, infantry, cavalry, and artillery. Citizens fill the windows overlooking Main Street and line the sidewalks to cheer column after column as they make their way to the depot of the York River Railroad or to the wharves at Rocket's for passage down the James. Women welcome them with food and drink and bouquets of flowers. The men respond with a rebel yell, and regimental bands swing into the bonny blue flag, Maryland, my Maryland, in Dixie." Flamboyant Robert Toombs, one of the founders of the Confederacy and now a brigadier general in Johnston's army, is especially noticeable. Looking revolutionary in a flaring black slouch hat and tossing red scarf, he personally leads each regiment of his brigade in turn past the cheering throng in front of the Spotswood Hotel, making sure all Richmond knows that Toombs' brigade is on its way to war. The first two brigades reach Yorktown on April 7th, and a third the next day. On the 10th, another brigade arrives, and on the 11th, 3 more. By that date, General Magruder's force stands at 34,400, 2.5 times his strength just a week earlier when the Federals begin their march on Yorktown, and he finally begins to breathe easier. Prince John expresses himself utterly surprised that his opponent has permitted day after day to elapse without an assault, but he is properly grateful nonetheless. Joe Johnston is equally surprised. After inspecting the Warwick line and hearing what Magruder has to say about those first days of the siege, he tells General Lee no one but McClellan could have hesitated to attack. On April 11th, taking a leaf from General Magruder's book on bluff, the CSS Virginia appears suddenly out of the morning haze and steams slowly and menacingly towards the Federal squadron in Hampton Roads. Suddenly, the Union forces in the channel scramble to counter. The USS Monitor and her consorts clear for battle, seeking to draw the monster deeper into the roadstead to give the ramming vessels the sea room they need to make their runs at the enemy. By contrast, the Virginia's commander, Flag Officer Josiah Tatnall, is determined to lure the Monitor into the narrow waters of the upper bay, engage her there, and capture her. He knows of the Yankee rams and is heard to say that he is not going out into enemy waters to get punched. The battle must be fought up there. Hour after hour, the contestants feign and challenge and exchange random shots at long range, but neither commander would forego his tactical plan, and at last Virginia steams back to her lair in Norfolk. The standoff would be repeated several times in the coming weeks. By threat alone, the CSS Virginia succeeds in guarding Norfolk and sealing off the James River and in neutralizing every major fighting ship in the Federal squadron. General Johnston first reaches Richmond from the Rapidan River on April 12th, to be greeted by President Davis with new orders. Magruder's Army of the Peninsula and Huger's command at Norfolk are thereby folded into Johnston's command, which is officially styled in these orders as the Army of Northern Virginia. Johnston himself refers to continue calling his command the Army of the Potomac, as if in deliberate defiance of the Federal Army of the same name. Some who communicate with Johnston in these weeks use one name for his army and some the other. Jefferson Davis even addresses him as commander of the Army of Richmond. Despite these eccentricities, the majority of Confederate troops and civilians find it almost convenient to refer to the force now defending Yorktown as the Army of Northern Virginia. Officially at this time though, the Confederate force's name on paperwork, reports, and documents is the Department of Northern Virginia. When the Army of Northern Virginia eventually arrives in the defensive works around Yorktown, General Johnston consolidates his armies into 3 wings, also called positions, absorbing Magruder's Army of the Peninsula into his command. Holding the sector of the Warwick Line designated as the right of position is Magruder's forces, consisting of 2 divisions under Brigadier Generals Lafayette McLaws and Robert Toombs, respectively. McLaws' division contains 4 brigades, while Toombs' division has 2. Holding the center of position on the Warwick Line is Major General James Longstreet's division, comprised of 6 brigades. Finally, the left of position, centered around Yorktown itself, is commanded by Major General Daniel Harvey Hill, consisting of Brigadier General Jubal Anderson Early's division of 2 brigades and Brigadier General Gabriel J. Rains' division, also 2 brigades strong. The Confederates also have at their disposal a body of men designated as a reserve, led by Major General Gustavus W. Smith, a man that General Johnston had named his second in command over the gathering army. The Department of Northern Virginia's reserves consists of troops from the District of Aquia, which General Smith had assumed command of from Major General Theophilus Holmes on March 23rd. Smith leads only a single brigade under Brigadier General Charles W. Field in the Aquia District, while bringing the rest of his command to the peninsula. The reserve also includes Brigadier General William H. C. Whiting's division and 2 brigades directly reporting to Smith, Brigadier General Samuel R. Anderson's brigade, made up of Tennesseans, and Brigadier General Johnston Pettigrew's brigade. Additional cavalry and artillery reserves in Johnston's forces include Brigadier General Jeb Stuart's cavalry brigade, Brigadier General William M. Pendleton's artillery corps, actually a battalion in both size and available guns, and Colonel James B. Walton's Washington, Louisiana Artillery Battalion, made up of 4 batteries. In total, the Confederate forces around Yorktown and defending the Warwick Line numbers 72,379 men. General Johnston says that Major General Magruder is certainly to be commended for his efforts, but everything is wrong with his current disposition. The Army's line is incomplete and badly drawn. It is purely defensive, with no avenues for an offensive. The artillery is inadequate. The Federals, with their naval and armed superiority, would surely turn one or both flanks. On the morning of April 14th, Johnston is back in Richmond and delivering his gloomy report to President Davis. He wants to abandon Yorktown immediately and pull right back to Richmond, the better place to contend against the enemy host. Davis calls together a council of advisors to take up this momentous question. He has General Lee and Secretary of War George W. Randolph join them, while Johnston brings in his 2 senior generals, Gustavus W. Smith and James Longstreet. Inside the President's office in the Confederate White House, from 11 that morning until 1 o'clock the next morning, with only a break for the dinner hour, the 6 of them debate the proper strategy for meeting the invaders. Collectively, they possess a remarkable range of personal knowledge of the general opposing them. Lee had commanded young Lieutenant McClellan in the Corps of Engineers during the Mexican War, and Longstreet too had made his acquaintance in the old army. Joe Johnston had been McClellan's close friend in the decade before the war, and G.W. Smith his closest friend. As a junior officer, McClellan was the protege of then U.S. Secretary of War Jefferson Davis. Mr. Davis, Longstreet recalled, took special note of the high attainments and capacity of General McClellan. Repeating his arguments for abandoning the Yorktown line, Johnston urges that all the forces from his command and from Magruder's on the peninsula and Hughes's at Norfolk, reinforced by garrison troops from the Carolinas and Georgia, be massed at Richmond for a showdown battle against the invading army. Alternatively, he proposes leaving Magruder to hold Yorktown for as long as he could while the rest of the army marches north to menace Washington, and as Longstreet phrases it, call McClellan to his own capital. Longstreet predicts that McClellan, being a careful-minded military engineer, would not be prepared to assault Magruder before May 1st. Smith adds his support for Johnston's plan and strongly presses for an invasion of the North that would not stop at Washington but go on to Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York. Randolph and Lee take an opposite tack. Randolph points out that giving up Yorktown would also mean giving up Norfolk and its important Navy Yard, where there are ironclads and gunboats under construction and where the CSS Virginia is based. Lee adds his voice to the argument for continuing to hold the Lower Peninsula, primarily for the time it would give them, time to complete the difficult transformation of the Confederacy's one-year volunteer army into a for-the-war army, time to begin enlarging that army through the conscription law then being acted on by the Congress, and time to forestall the call-up of reinforcements from other areas. Immediately stripping the Carolinas and Georgia of troops, he warns, would very likely lead to the loss of Charleston and Savannah. In any case, Lee says, the Lower Peninsula is well suited defensively for fighting the Yankees. The debate continues hour after hour until all the arguments and all the participants are exhausted, and then Mr. Davis announces his decision. Johnston was to shift the rest of his army, the troops of Smith and Longstreet, to Yorktown and make a stand there for as long as it was practicable to do so. Whatever General McClellan gained on the peninsula, he would have to fight for. Joe Johnston accepts the decision without protest. The Siege of Yorktown would continue.